I moved to Los Angeles in 1998, met my girlfriend the following year, then by Y2K we were living in a small Silver Lake apartment together. We were very compatible, and where we weren't almost identical, our personal differences complemented each other in a way that made us work. But there was one thing we could not agree on, and that was my love of camping. I pitched tents everywhere from Joshua Tree to the Sierras, and it became especially important to me once I moved to the concrete jungle of LA. Getting away from the big city became doubly important just to decompress. I'd swap all the smog for cool, clean air, and then wake up to the sound of birds singing instead of traffic and the yelling of crazy homeless people. My girlfriend, on the other hand, was way more into luxury hotels and spa weekends, and the most she'd ever theoretically commit to in terms of camping was a tour of the West Coast in a camper van. And even then, she said that she'd have to really think about it so she could make sure that she had as many home comforts as possible on hand. And so, without outright coercing her, I started a weeks-long campaign to try and change her mind. I started showing her epic photos from my past trips, emphasizing things like stargazing and how the fresh air would be great for her. She's very much a health nut like that. I then started working the whole "it'll be romantic" angle, telling her how it'd be just me and her without anyone else for miles around, how we'd get to soak up all the good vibes nature was making while making s'mores with roasted marshmallows, her one true weakness. She'd always counter with something like, "What if a bunch of bugs crawl into the tent?" Or, "What if we pick the one day a year when it rains in LA?" And while I did kind of understand her concerns, it didn't stop me. I just so happened to pick the Reese Witherspoon movie Wild to watch while we were eating takeout. And then the next week it'd be Into the Wild. And you might be noticing a little theme here because she sure did. And then after maybe 2 months of slowly and gently convincing her, she agreed to a sort of compromise. No multi-day backpacking deep in the mountains, no eating of canned garbage and drinking creek water that tasted like chlorine pills. Instead, we go someplace a little closer to home, Runyon Canyon Park. Now, anyone who knows the park might be laughing right now because it's literally just a foothill in the middle of Hollywood, and if you look it up, you can see the Hollywood sign right there above you. It's surrounded by concrete on 3 sides, so it's probably like the least wild place I could possibly pick out. But seeing as it was so urban adjacent, low commitment, and easy to bail if she hated it, my girlfriend approved. I mean, maybe I'm talking the place down a little for the purposes of the story because some of the views that you get up there are absolutely fantastic. I mean, you can see all the way out to the ocean on a good day, and all of that after some very convenient parking. We could park on the street, pack light, and be on the trail quickly, and then after a day's hike we could set up our little tent and let the real fun begin. We headed out into the late afternoon to beat some of the crowds. Runyon is always popular with runners and off-leash dogs. And then starting from the bottom, we took a mix of trails from a solid loop until we hit the wooden steps up the East Ridge toward Inspiration Point, where the views open up dramatically over Los Angeles. It wasn't brutal, but enough to get the blood pumping and earn that we're really outdoors feeling. And then by the time the sun was almost set and the city lights started twinkling below, it felt magical. We found a nice, somewhat tucked-away spot on a flatter section of ridge as dusk settled, and while we weren't quite allowed a roaring campfire thanks to the park's rules, we had a nice little setup with a portable lantern stepping in for ambience. The hike had worn us both out in the best of ways, and her complaining turned to laughter as we watched the sunset paint the sky. It wasn't deep backcountry solitude, but for Los Angeles, it delivered epic views, and she admitted it wasn't as scary as she thought. And before we climbed into our tent, I suggested that we hit up Big Sur on our next trip, to which she starts responding, saying, "Oh, easy, Tiger, let's see how I feel in the morning." But what neither of us knew at that moment was how neither of us was going to make it until morning. And so after crawling into the tent, we settled down on the sleeping mats that I'd brought along with me. She had the extra comfy one, I used my old one. And then after a little pillow talk, it was too warm to cuddle, we each went off to sleep. And then the next thing I know, I'm waking up to the gentle pitter-patter sound of water hitting the fabric of the tent. And my first thought was, holy crap, she was right. We picked the one night of the year when it rains in LA. But that was just the first of a couple of different thoughts, because the second one involved me realizing that it couldn't have been rain. The stream of fluid was too localized to the side of the tent and too loud to be anything but one solid stream coming from someplace. And that's when it hit me that some a-hole was literally pissing all over my damn tent. Now, I reacted much like anyone would and immediately shouted something loud and curse-filled while making a beeline for the zipper keeping the flap shut. I was furious, dude. I mean, I figured it was probably just a bunch of kids doing it as a prank after one of his buddies dared him to do it. But I was banking on being able to chase them off into the darkness and giving them a little scare for their troubles. But then, as I'm thrusting my feet into my shoes, I smell it. This sharp, acrid smell that smelled like something flammable. And then no sooner was I like, uh-oh, but woof. The side of our tent burst into flames from where someone either tossed a match or put a lighter to it and set all that flammable liquid on fire. My girlfriend was obviously awake by the time we saw the flames because I'd been shouting and moving around all angrily and insane, and so while I was still sitting there with my foot half in my shoe, it was her who grabbed the little pocket knife that she was keeping under her mat, blade open too, usually a big no-no, and started slashing at the wall of the tent to make a hole and make it fast. Each of us dived out of it, and I remember looking back expecting to see either total darkness or the last of the kids who set our tent on fire running into it. Instead, I saw maybe 4 or 5 guys, grown-ass men by the looks of things, and they weren't running either. They were just standing there, watching us as we spilled out of the slash in terror and confusion. I just shouted, "Run," but my girlfriend had already looked and was screaming as she ran for the trail. Now, I kind of lagged behind her a little, looking back and getting ready to fight when they started to chase us, but neither of them did anything but stand there silently, either watching the tent burn or watching us run from it. And somehow, I feel like that freaked me out just as much as if they did chase us. It kind of felt like they didn't need to, you know? Like they'd already set up a blocking force for us and we were running right into it. But thankfully, that was just the fear talking, and we ran and ran through the darkness without ever bumping into anyone, let alone anyone with bad intentions for us. Luckily, I had my car keys on a chain along with a couple of others, so we were able to get into my car and start the engine without issue. But when the headlights lit up the scene in front of us, and we could see that there was no one following us, and we kind of took it down a gear, and instead of driving off frantic, we took a second to just say, what the actual F just happened to us up there? We did drive off pretty soon after, on the off chance that they were following us somehow, and then we reported what had happened to the cops once we got back. But, and any LA natives were probably thinking this from the very beginning, but the detective we spoke to was not sympathetic to what we did. Now, he wasn't overly rude, but he basically asked us what the hell we were thinking trying to camp up on Runyon Canyon, because while it can be a pretty beautiful place and very charming to Midwest transplants like me, the park's just too damn close to the city to really be safe. He obviously felt bad that someone had tried to burn us alive, but he also said that we made his job pretty damn hard, seeing as there were tons of kids in that area who were capable of such a thing, not to mention all the crazies that walk up and down Hollywood Boulevard, which is pretty close by. Someone might have been drunk, bought a bunch of lighter fluid planning on burning the Hollywood sign, but then they saw our tent and figured, hey, beats hiking another 2 miles uphill. And it was that simple. It could have been just about anyone, and the chances of catching them were slim to none. Now, he didn't think that there was much to it, there being 4 of them or 5 of them, and them just watching us either, as he said that there might have been gangbangers, or we were in their favorite smoking spot, or literally anything. And in so many words, we made one hell of a mistake, and my girlfriend never let me hear the end of it. She never went camping again, which meant I only went like twice the whole time that we were together. And then the first thing I did when we broke up was head out on some week-long hiking trip out in the Sierras. It wasn't a bad breakup, and I never felt resentful or anything that she refused to try it again in any place, because ultimately I do kind of think it was my fault. I think I should have dropped the issue when she first said no and just gone someplace on my own that'd be safer. At least, safer from people, that is. So I used to live for camping. It was honestly my entire personality. The second best feeling in the world to me was hauling my pack onto my back after counting the days, assembling gear, and poring over maps of the area I'd be heading to, just so I could familiarize myself with them in advance. And then the best feeling, on the other hand, was hitting that part of the woods where there was nothing but me, the trees, and all that quiet. It was my happy place, and I've been doing it since back when I was a kid, when my dad would drag us all up into the mountains every summer. I used to hate it when I was smaller, but then as I got older, I learned to appreciate it, and it snowballed from there until it was weekends, long weekends, even solo trips when nobody else would tag along. Now, my buddy Squirrel and I were like the main two dudes. If I planned a little trip, my friend named Squirrel was almost guaranteed to show up with his gear. Oh, and he's called Squirrel because picture a guy named Squirrel and that's what he looked like. No joke. Plus his name was actually Daryl, so it kind of rhymed actually, but anyways. Now way back when, Daryl and I headed up to the spot that we've been eyeing for months. It was kind of a tradition by that point because every spring for the past few years, we've been picking a tough trail, setting up camp in the backcountry, and then just unplugging from all the bullcrap of regular life for a couple of days. And then that year, after a solid hike of about 8 miles with some real elevation, we set up camp in a spot where the views were worth the blisters. We got there mid-afternoon and then set up the tent in a nice little clearing under these big old pine trees. The wind was picking up a little bit, but nothing crazy, and we figured it was just mountain weather doing its thing. We lit a campfire, cooked some dogs and cracked a couple of beers, and then talked about a whole bunch of nothing important until the sun went down and the stars came out. Even the breeze kind of worked after we climbed into our tent to get some rest, and after all that hiking and all that beer, I think I fell asleep the second my head hit the sleeping mat. But then, at around 2 in the morning, we woke up to the tent shaking like it was about to blow away. Now that must have picked up suddenly, and bad too, because it had gone from breeze to full-on gale force winds that were roaring through the pines like a freaking freight train. It woke me and Squirrel up quick, one then the other, and then we're yelling over the noise about whether we should pack up and move. Now camping under a whole bunch of trees isn't the best of ideas, especially if they're kind of isolated. They make for great cover, but also they attract lightning. But since we also couldn't think of anywhere close worth moving to, and since it didn't seem smart to go out into the pitch-black pouring rain, moving on seemed dumber than staying put. And so we zipped the tent tight and got ready to ride out. And then not even 10 minutes later, it happened. There was this loud crack, like a gunshot almost, and then this massive whoosh, and so fast I didn't even have time to scream. A huge branch, what they call widowmaker, came down right on top of the side of my tent. Now, widowmakers are the dead ones, just hanging up there waiting to drop when nature takes its course, or a strong enough wind comes along to do the job for it. And it hit like a ton of bricks, with the pain exploding in my left leg and hip the second it landed. Now I heard my own bones snap, dude. I didn't just feel it, I heard it happen. It also pinned me across my lower body, crushing my leg and smashing my pelvis. I couldn't even breathe right at first, let alone move. Squirrel asked if I was okay, and I responded no, in this really strained voice, and then he freaked out trying to get the branch off of me, but it wouldn't budge. The rain was still hammering down, and the wind was still screaming, and so every time a gust hit, and the trees around us groaned like they were about to come down, too. Now, I was yelling in pain, telling Squirrel to stop because he was only making it worse. I saw the blood was soaking through my sleeping bag too, and even though I could feel my leg twisted all wrong underneath me, the blood scared me more than anything. I told Squirrel that he had to go get help. He didn't want to leave me at first, and I could see it in his face with my headlamp shining up at him, but he knew that he had no choice. We both did. We were miles from the trailhead. No cell service, nothing. It was either him or nothing. And so he grabbed his pack, left me his extra flashlight and some water, and then took off running down the trail in the storm. I watched his light bounce away through the thin canvas of the tent till it disappeared, and then I was all alone. Obviously, I pulled through, or I wouldn't be writing this, right? So there's really no point doing that whole thing of will he or won't he make it, because no prizes of anyone guessing that obviously I did. But I was up on that hill for around 8 to 9 hours, and they were the longest of my entire life. The pain was nonstop. Every single breath hurt like someone was grinding my bones. I tried to shift myself a little bit every so often, purely out of desperation, I guess. But that branch had me locked down solid, and any attempt to move only made the pain worse. I got soaking wet too, as the rain kept on leaking through the ripped tent, so it wasn't long before I was soaked to the bone and very cold. I kept talking to myself out loud, stupid stuff like, "You're okay, buddy. Help's coming." But I wasn't okay. The fact help was coming was the only thing that kept my mind in one piece, because by far the worst part was the fear. Every gust of wind made those big pine trees creak and sway overhead. I kept staring up into the dark, waiting for another crack, another widowmaker to finish the job. I kept asking myself, what if the whole tree came down? What if Squirrel slipped and broke his ankle out there? What if he makes it but he can't find his way in the dark until it's too late for me? My life didn't so much flash before my eyes as my death did. I thought about my mom and dad, about my sister, about the guy at my job hearing about the way I died and thinking, poor dude. I thought about the autopsy they'd do, about my funeral. I tried not to, but I couldn't help it. I started singing songs in my head, counted stars when the clouds broke, prayed a little, even though I really am not one for church, but every time my mind went back to dying again. Time got weird too. Minutes felt like hours, and the only consolation I got was not feeling like I was about to pass out or go into shock. I think I lost a lot of blood, but the pain kept me awake, and that's how I knew I wasn't completely screwed, which, like I said, kept me sane. Finally, sometime after dawn broke, I heard voices. I yelled out as best I could, and then I saw lights coming through the trees. Squirrel had made it, having run those miles in the stormy dark like a man possessed. He brought a whole rescue crew, paramedics, forest rangers, S&R guys who had the gear to lift the branch. They worked carefully, talking me through what they were doing the whole time. And then when they finally moved the wood and got me on a stretcher, I almost passed out from the relief. There were all these new pains as stuff started to shift in my leg and hip, but the relief of feeling all that pressure taken away was, well, I've never felt anything quite like it before or since. They got me to the hospital, but thanks to the pain meds, the memories of it are all kind of blurred. I got surgery on my leg and they put pins in my pelvis. The doctors said I was lucky, that my nerves were mostly intact and I wouldn't need an amputation. But luckily, ain't the word that I'd use to describe the months of rehabilitation where I basically had to learn to walk all over again. I walk with a limp now and sometimes with a cane on bad days. I had to forget all about camping, at least serious camping anyway, and hiking, I can pretty much forget it. It took me a long time before I could lie in a tent without my chest getting tight, and even all these years later, I still have nightmares where I'm crushed by something, usually an elevator that gets smaller and smaller until I can't breathe, and then it falls like whoosh, just like that branch did. And life's different now, and by that I mean a lot slower. I garden a little, watch birds from the backyard. I'm grateful to still be here, but man, I miss those nights under the stars. That widowmaker took more than my mobility that night. It took a piece of who I was. Sometimes I drive up to the old trailhead just to sit and look at the mountains. I don't get out, but the woods are still beautiful from a distance, and the fact that I'm still here to see them, that's something, right? Me and Squirrel are still good friends, but he doesn't much look like a squirrel anymore. He comes around sometimes and will sit on the porch, drink beer, and reminisce about old trips. I sold most of my gear, but I kept one tent. Maybe if I have kids someday, they can have it, and if they want to go camping with their Uncle Squirrel, because I know no matter what happens, Squirrel's got their backs, just like he did that day with mine. More than 3 decades ago, when my buddy Henry and I, who I call Hank, were still in high school, we got so bored one spring break that we decided to go camping out in South Texas brush country. If you drive southwest of Corpus Christi away from all the palm trees, white sandy beaches, and turquoise blue ocean, the land suddenly flattens out into this endless stretch of scrub. We call it the brush, I suppose on account of it being so dry and bristly, but it should be called the thorns because those are what you really got to look out for. They'll prick you something awful if you're not careful where you're doing it, and even if you are careful, one stray branch will catch your clothes and put a hole in your shirt. It's not even counting all the prickly pears, but at least they're kind of colorful, and then aside from those, you got your black brush, your mesquite, and huisache trees, and one of the stars of our story here, the guajillo shrubs. Now don't get excited, chili fans, it's not related. It's hot, dry, and dusty. It's real drought country, but while most of the time it's all sandy and beige and sad looking, you get one good rain and bam, wildflowers start popping up all over the place and it can look really pretty. And that's what it looked like when me and Hank went out to camp that day, since it had rained a few days previous and thanks to the dry wash still being flooded, there was a gentle trickle of water into all the surrounding soil, meaning the brush was so green in places that the bushes were like thick walls that you could barely see through. And so there we were, walking on all that still, loamy soil after a full day's hike, and we're poking around looking for somewhere to set up camp. The sun was starting to dip, so the heat wasn't so bad anymore, and the air had that kind of fragrant green smell because of the rains. And then all of a sudden, as we're coming up to this big old guajillo bush, we start hearing this gentle buzzing sound floating through the air. It took me a second to figure out what it was, but as we got closer, I realized what it was long before I saw it. It was a beehive, but I couldn't figure out why it was so loud until I saw it. And I swear to Almighty God when I say this, but that thing was the size of a goddamn washing machine. No, I'd seen quite a few beehives by that age, and a couple of hornet nests too, but never one as gigantic as the one sitting in the crook of that guajillo. It was all gray and papery and loud too. I mean, obviously it's going to be louder if it's larger, but hearing that thing up close was freaky. Just that low hum from what must have been hundreds of bees crawling around in there, maybe thousands. We crept a little closer, not scared, just kind of awestruck by the sheer size of it. I mean, you know bees, right? You don't bother them, but sometimes they don't bother you. Wasps or hornets would have been a different story, and we would have been up and out of there faster than you can spit. But since it was just plain old honeybees, we stop and look for a second thinking, damn, would you look at that? And that would have saved us a whole lot of trouble if we had. And the first is that the guajillo's one of the bees' best friends out here in the brush, because it puts out those little blonde fuzzy flowers in early spring that the bees go crazy for. It's like prime rib for them down in these parts, so having their hive in a guajillo shrub is like having an apartment in a Buc-ee's, and looking back on it, it kind of makes sense how that thing was so big. But then the second thing I didn't know, and this is the real kicker, is that these were no ordinary bees, no sir. But unfortunately for us, there was no way of knowing until it was way too late. And so we stood there, looking at the beehive, having gotten as close as we could stomach. And then as we're looking at it, one of the bees kind of flies out and buzzes near my buddy for a second before zooming back to the hive. Now, we didn't see it for what it was, because we still thought that we were looking at regular bees. But by then, one by one, more and more of the little things came buzzing through the air towards us, like they were checking us out. No, I said, "Don't move a muscle, Hank. They're more scared of you than you are of them." But those little bastards were not scared of us, and they were about to go prove it in a big and bad way. The handful that came to check us out flew off, so both me and Hank were like, I dodged a bullet. But then suddenly, and it was like the whole entire hive kicked its buzzing up a gear, and we knew we'd pissed them off by being too close. We started backing up. Not too fast as to piss them off even more, but not too slow either, and you can be sure of that. But it did no good at all, and the last thing we saw before we turned tail and ran was this big black cloud of bees forming in the air as they came streaming out of the hive and straight towards us. Now I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, running through the maze of brush as we tried to escape this coming swarm. But the bees didn't need to follow me. They could fly over and through stuff that I had to go around, so even though I was going fast as anything, it wasn't before I started to feel a few stingers around my neck and shoulders. I screamed, swatting at the pain as I ran, but it did no good, and almost all the bees that caught up with me managed to stick their stingers someplace, either in the back of my neck or my shoulder where my vest didn't cover. And if you think I was getting it bad, you should have seen poor Hank. I was always the fastest out of the two of us, being taller and skinnier and such, so by the time the buzz behind me started to peter out and I actually dared to look back for Hank, he was some way behind me already, and he was getting absolutely mobbed. He was swatting at the bees as he was running, but even that just gave them more to sting. He wasn't particularly graceful either, so every time he's waving his arms around, it's throwing him off balance and slowing him down. He was getting eaten up back there. Like I genuinely think the bees were coming for me, but suddenly realizing that he was the easier target, and flew all the way back to kamikaze into him in one final screw you before they died. Now I was yelling, "Come on, Hank, run! Stop trying to hit him and just run!" But it was like the more they stung him, the slower he got. I ended up snapping a branch off a smaller mesquite tree, one that had a nice flash of green on the end, and then running back to try and swat away some of the bees that were chasing him. I ended up getting a couple of more stings, but it was worth it just to not to have to watch my buddy getting stung half to death while doing nothing about it. And when I say half to death, I mean half to death. He didn't actually look all that bad at first, because I guess there hadn't been enough time for all the stings to kick into his system yet. And so the first thing that caught my attention were all the stingers still stuck in his neck and arms and the back of his legs. Some had even flown up his shorts too, and while they hadn't inflicted any direct hits on the old meat, he had stingers stuck in his thighs as well as every other place. He was in a heck of a lot of pain, and he swatted them off of himself, but he couldn't walk, and he wanted out of there. And so off we went. But then, as we're walking, the swelling started. I mean, it wasn't funny at the time, and it's still not very funny thinking about it today, but Hank later joked about how he looked like some balloon animal. It was one of those dark humor type deals that didn't get so much as a laugh as the damn type reaction, but at the same time, I think that might be one of the most accurate descriptions possible. Hank went from looking regular to looking like he was made entirely of a red balloon animal, and he did so in the space of about 5 minutes. His face and eyelids swelled up into these tiny little slits, so bad he could barely see, and then his skin turned as red as a beet, but with these tiny little white stinger marks interspersed and welts popping up everywhere that he'd been stung. I remember being on the verge of telling him how bad it looked. Not to rub it in or anything, more to say almost like, "I think we're going to need a priest if we don't get you to a freaking hospital soon." But Hank didn't need telling. He knew. He started to pant as we walked, making these wheezing sounds as his throat started to close over. He kept saying how bad it burned, too, how it felt like his whole body was on fire, and how he needed Jesus to help him. And that last part was more of a reflexive thing, saying, "Lord, help me. Jesus, help me." But I've never heard Hank talk like that before, like he had one of God's hands on him already, and it was scaring me. Not just because of how bad it looked and sounded, but because we had miles upon miles of thick South Texas brush between us and the nearest stretch of road. And I didn't know how much longer Hank had in him before he just keeled over and couldn't walk anymore. Not even a mile into the journey, Hank started limping real bad where one leg was getting stiff from all the bee venom that he had running through his veins. He was grunting with every step, cussing under his breath as he stumbled into thorns. Sweat was practically pouring off of him too, with those big beads of it running down his neck and forehead. Now I asked him if he needed a rest, so he'd have the energy to keep going, But Hank said that he wanted to keep moving, that he needed that hospital and he needed it bad. But then, after about another mile, he started to get faint. His knees buckled at one point and he almost went face first into a prickly pear, and I caught him under the arm and held him up, telling him to stay with me. But then, the vomiting started. Hank doubled over after pulling his arm away from me, and then he heaved until nothing came out. I thought he was done because he kinda got up on one knee, but then the heaving started all over again, very dry this time. That was when I was most scared he was going to die, right there under that cat claw. They call them wait a minute bushes too because they give a nice patch of shade, but we didn't have a minute. We kept on going, but Hank's breathing got shallower and he started shaking like a leaf while almost dragging that stiff leg of his behind him. We'd walk 20 yards, stop so he could puke or lean on some tree, and then push on again. Now, I kept telling him that he didn't have much further to go, even though I knew it was a lie. And I said just about anything and everything to keep him going, to keep his mind focused too, anything so he wouldn't just straight keel over and pass out. I had to support him the last part of the way, and that felt like it went on forever. But after all that heat and dust and those goddamn thorns, with Jake getting weaker by the minute, we finally broke through the brush and spotted the highway ahead of us. Since I figured it was safe to let Hank lay down, I tried telling him that he could stop and finally rest some, but he didn't need to be told. He went down like some sack of potatoes the second he realized that it was asphalt ahead of him and not just some more scrub. And then I ran in the middle of that road and started waving at any approaching truck. This old boy in a diesel dually slammed on the brakes, took one look at Hank, then jumped out to help me get him into the back seat. After that, we hauled ass back towards Corpus Christi, calling 911 on the way while Hank was just slumped in the back seat. And by the time they wheeled him into the ER, I was convinced I was never going to talk to my friend again. But the doctors knew just what to do for all that bee venom that he had in him, and while I couldn't even begin to tell you what it was, it sure as hell worked. Hank spent a couple of days in the hospital with doctors keeping him monitored while all the swelling went down, but he pulled through. In fact, we knew pretty quickly that he would, because the doctors told a gathering of me and his family that we'd gotten him to the hospital pretty much just in time, and they could get to treating him before all that bee venom started damaging his liver or kidneys. I don't think I was listening all that hard after hearing that Hank was going to be fine. I was too relieved to do anything but fall back on a chair with my head in my hands while holding back tears of relief. I had to doubly hold them back when Hank's mom started hugging me and saying that I saved her son's life. I don't know if I agree with that, but she sure made it seem that way at the time, and even Hank's dad was rolling a few silent tears at the news that his son was going to pull through. In the end, the only question that was left was, why the heck did those bees act so aggressive? And to that question, there was a very clear answer. Like I said, those bees were no ordinary bees. And a lot of y'all are probably going to be hooting and hollering at this saying, I knew it. But we were told they were called what's Africanized honeybees, or more commonly known to you as killer bees. And the whole story of them goes something like this. Back in the 50s, Brazil had the bright idea of crossbreeding their native honeybees with African honeybees, with the goal being to up the amount of honey they were making. This did the trick all right, but it also meant the hybrid bees were extra aggressive. Like so aggressive that they killed a bunch of people just from the sheer number of times they'd sting someone. The Brazilians tried to contain these killer bees, but they broke out sometime in the 70s, I think, and they slowly but surely made their way up through Central America and Mexico, and then up into the southern United States for me and Hank to stumble across one day. It was a big story at the time, and it was wild thinking that me and him had been a part of it in some really small way. We stayed friends for years afterwards until he moved away on some scholarship, and he never got much faster, but he did get way bigger, and not in a bad way. We never did go camping again. Hank swore it off completely, and then after he moved away, we kinda lost touch. It's sad, but such is the way of the world, I suppose. But I know he won't ever have forgotten about that evening that we spent out in the brush, and how nature was really quick to remind me of who's really in charge out there. So it was early June of 2003 here in West Virginia, and my buddies and I had just graduated college, and we'd been planning a post-grad camping trip for months that I was really looking forward to. There was me and my three buddies, Bobby, Mike, and Josh. And since we'd been camping together before, we figured a few nights out in the woods wouldn't be a problem. We packed up Mike's brother's old pickup with some tents, a cooler full of meats, and some beer that we had talked him into buying us, and then drove out to the spot in the hills that Bobby swore was perfect. And he was right, too. It was quiet, pretty, and right next to a creek. It was the kind of scene that looked like it could have been on a postcard, really. But looks, as they say, can be deceiving. We got there late afternoon after a real sweaty hike and found that creek sparkling like it was ice-cold liquid crystal. We set up camp really quick, got ourselves a fire going, and then set up a grill that we'd brought with us so that we could cook up some burgers while we drank our beers. Now, by the time the sun started dropping, we were feeling pretty good. One of those nights that makes you forget about all your worldly cares. But I was wiped, like dead on my feet, tired. I pulled extra shifts all week, and the hike up into the hills just finished me off. And so when the boys decided to head down to the creek to take a little bath before we turned in for the night, I just waved it off. They called me a lightweight and laughed, and then took off down the little path towards the creek. I could hear them yelling and carrying on like kids, and it sounded like they were having a blast. But I just leaned back into my camp chair, cracked another beer, and watched the fire as the woods got darker. After a bit, the guys came back, dripping wet and grinning, and we threw some wood on the fire and settled in for the usual campfire talk. You know, things like old stories, dumb mistakes, who was dating who, and everything was great. The vibes were good, but then Mike started acting off. At around 10, he stood up and just rubbed his stomach and said he felt kind of sick. Now, he looked pale in my flashlight beam and said something about probably eating too fast before he headed into his tent and saying he needed to lie down. And Bobby was next. He kept scratching his arms and neck, saying how the skeeters must have eaten him alive down at the creek. He tossed another log on the fire so the smoke would keep them away, and since the woods are always full of bugs, none of us thought much of it. Josh was the only one where I thought something was obviously wrong. Not just too much beer or being skeeter bait, but legitimately having some sort of medical thing. Something about his face looked weird, a little puffy like he'd been stung or something. When I asked him though, he just shrugged and suggested that he was a little allergic to something. He felt fine, so he wasn't worried. Now, he kept talking for another half hour, but by that point, the energy was dying down. Josh crawled into his tent and I stayed up a little longer staring at the coals, and then finally laid down on my sleeping bag to catch some Z's. Now that night I slept like a baby. No tossing or turning, no dreams I can remember. I was just completely exhausted. And so all I really remember is lying there listening to the crickets and then waking up to the sound of someone vomiting. And hard too, like they were trying to puke their guts up. Now I sat up fast, head still kind of foggy as I unzipped the tent, and then what I saw made my stomach drop. Mike was on his knees by a tree, making all the puking sounds that I'd heard, while Bobby was sitting groaning against a log with his arms and face covered in ugly red blotches. Josh, on the other hand, he looked the worst. His eyes were almost swollen shut, and his cheeks and forehead were puffy and red, and it sounded like he was having trouble breathing, too. It looked like they were all dying, and painfully, too, the kind that makes tough teenage boys whimper for their moms. Now, I asked them what the hell happened, but no one really said much. Mike was puking too hard. Bobby was scratching himself, talking about how it burned and itched all at once. And then there was Josh, wheezing while talking about not being able to see. And all three were just begging for my help. And the first thing I thought to do was grab water. Stuff for Mike and Bobby to drink, and stuff to maybe pour over Josh's face, because hopefully cooling it off might have helped with the swelling or something. But they didn't need water. They needed immediate medical attention, and the pressure of it being down to me was probably the single worst feeling of my entire life. Nobody thinks they're going to be the hero in the moment, I guess. You just do what you gotta do. But all I remember thinking as I ran for the trail was they're going to die, and I'm going to end up an alcoholic wondering if I could have saved my friends. But I guess the terror of that thought spurred me on and did almost the opposite of me panicking, because after that, I was just an absolute machine. Our phones obviously had zero signal out here, so the first thing that I did was grab the map from Bobby's bag and look for the nearest ranger station. When I spotted one 4 miles down the road, I took a second to check my bearings and then took off running like a crazy person. I'd never run like that before in my whole life, and the only sport that I played was backyard football, so while 4 miles didn't sound all that far on paper, in practice, it was complete hell on wheels. My legs started to feel like lead. I puked, had to slow down before I passed out, all of that. But I never stopped. I never once stopped still. And those 3 miles felt like it could have been 300, and I lost count of the number of times I tripped and almost fell. But when I finally burst through those trees and saw the ranger station, I almost cried with joy and relief. After I banged on the door as hard as I could, the ranger on duty, a guy named Daryl, came to the door angry as hell, asking what all the fuss was about. He took one look at me and got serious real quick. I told him everything about my buddies and the weird symptoms they had, and he relayed all directly to county dispatch. Now, within maybe 20 minutes of my arriving there, a couple of ATVs showed up with paramedics, and we raced back to where we were camped. When we got there, the guys were in even worse shape, but the medics moved fast. They had IVs, oxygen, and other stuff all ready to go, and then after wrapping them up and loading them onto the ATVs, they disappeared off down the trail. They airlifted them from a clearing near the station while me and Daryl followed in the ranger's truck all the way to the hospital in the nearest town. The whole drive, they kept asking questions about what we did, what we touched, and when I mentioned the creek, his face got tight, and then he said how they'd had problems up there a couple of times before. I asked him what kind of problems, but he said it was best to wait for whatever the doctor said. At the hospital, I sat in the waiting room covered in dirt and sweat, feeling useless for hours and hours, until finally a doctor came out and explained what had happened. It was chemical burns, severe poisoning from something dumped in the creek that the boys had washed in. He said that there were probably industrial solvents, all kinds of heavy metals, and God knows what else. We later found out someone had been illegally dumping waste upstream, probably for about a year for the water to get that bad. The water looked fine, but it was poison, and my friends had done just about everything but go swimming right in it. They'd splashed around it, drank a bunch, and then let it get in their eyes, and that's why it hit them so hard while I was completely unaffected. All 3 of my friends pulled through, thank God, but not without side effects. Mike still gets stomach issues sometimes when he eats certain things. Bobby won't even use bug spray anymore because the smell reminds him. And these days, Josh wears sunglasses when the sun's too bright for him. The cops and environmental people get involved. It turns out it was some shady company cutting corners, paying off truckers to dump barrels into the woods. They got caught eventually, but that didn't fix what happened to us, and we never went camping again, and never even discussed it. The 4 of us still hang out, but now it's just barbecues in somebody's backyard or catching a game at a bar. And even today, every time I see a creek or a lake, I get this certain feeling in my chest. We set up camp right next to the whole creek full of liquid death and didn't even know it, while the decision to stay by the fire might well have saved my life. We survived, but man, we sure as hell learned our lesson. Be careful with water sources when you're out in the trails, especially when it comes to drinking stuff, because no matter how nice and clean it looks, you never really know what's in there, not until it's too late. So it came out of nowhere. One minute we were laughing around the fire, swapping dumb stories and roasting marshmallows. Then the next minute, it all came smashing down on us like some kind of apocalyptic event. We planned the trip for weeks, thinking some camping out on the flats would be fun. It was me, my buddy Scott, his girlfriend Sarah, and her cousin Ryan. We hiked on the Friday afternoon, found a sweet spot by the river, and set up camp before the sun dropped. We had some dogs, marshmallows, and graham crackers, the whole ordeal. Now, Scott kept saying that it was the best trip ever, but looking back on it, those feel like famous last words. Saturday started just fine. We fished a little, hiked a little, and then were back at camp by early evening. We had a fire roaring, music playing low on the portable speaker, and then off in the distance we saw a lightning flash from some dark clouds as a storm moved in our direction. Not long after, the wind picked up. Not too much, just enough to whip the trees around a little. We figured that it might rain, but that was no big deal. We just tossed a couple of extra logs in the fire and kept on doing our thing. And then suddenly, and from out of absolutely nowhere, the first hailstone hit like a gunshot. When it landed right in the dirt by Sarah's foot, we saw it was the size of a golf ball. There was like a split second where we were all silently thinking, did that just happen? But then came the next couple, and there was no doubting it anymore. Then the next minute, it was almost like God emptied a giant freezer up there in the sky. Ball-sized chunks of ice slammed down onto us, not little pellets. These things had weight, and they actually whistled as they fell. One nailed the cooler and split the plastic on the lid. Another put a hole straight through the roof of the tent. Someone yelled to get under the trees, but they barely helped, and branches cracked overhead as hail ripped through the leaves. We scrambled to cover our heads with whatever we could grab: sleeping bags, backpacks, anything that might provide enough shelter. Sarah screamed when one caught her hand. I heard the crack from 10 feet away, and Scott tried to pull her toward the bigger pines, but a hailstone smacked him in the shoulder and almost dropped him to his knees. Ryan was cursing up a storm, blood already running down his face from a gash on his forehead. I don't remember the one that got me, just the sudden explosion of pain on the side of my head, and then nothing. My lights went out. And when I woke up, the world was spinning. My scalp felt split open and the blood was sticking in my hair and down my neck. My left hand throbbed with 2 fingers already swelling up fat and purple, and the camp looked like some war zone. Tent shredded, gear scattered and battered to hell, and the fire was dead too, just these wet ashes and broken branches. Scott was shaking me, asking me if I was good in a voice that just sounded far away, and Sarah sat nearby crying, holding her broken fingers against her chest. Ryan had a t-shirt wrapped around his head already soaked in blood, and the hail had stopped, but the damage was done. We were all bruised up badly with cuts everywhere, and my head pounded like someone was hammering nails into my skull. Now, the hike out was supposed to be just a couple of miles, but it might as well have been 100. We packed everything that wasn't destroyed, but that meant my pack was a hell of a lot lighter than it had been on the way in, but every step still hurt. My vision kept blurring, and I kept stopping to lean against the trees while the others waited. Scott's shoulder looked messed up, and Sarah couldn't even use her hand, and Ryan kept pressing that shirt to his scalp and muttering that he probably needed stitches. Now we fumbled across the flats in near silence, mostly just heavy breathing and the occasional groan. My brain felt like someone had taken a chunk out of it, and the trees kept moving when they really shouldn't have, and at one point I thought that I saw the trail split in two, but Scott steered me straight and kept me from falling down. We finally got back to where we were parked at around 3 in the morning, and after piling into the truck like the walking wounded we were, we drove straight to the hospital. The doctors poked and prodded and asked me a million questions, and then told me that I had a concussion, some fractured fingers, and lacerations that probably needed stitches. And they kept us for a few hours, pumped us full of painkillers, and then sent us on our way. That was 2 years ago. We still talk about it sometimes, but never like it was fun, and we quit camping completely after that one. Some people say nature is beautiful, and sure, it is. But nature literally almost killed us with goddamn ice bombs one time. And so these days, I'll just take my couch and some YouTube. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All these links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.